All right. Welcome to the Writestream. This is Writestream number 8 already. Today's initial topic is bad guys, but of course I will field any questions that you have already. Before getting to that topic, what I want to talk about with bad guys, which is villains, is basically some things that make villains, I think, convincing based on what other people have done, and things which make villains an actual force, something that the reader feels fear about or has some sense of anxiety about, villains that a reader thinks are going to be successful. And this is the case whether you're, regardless of what media you're working in, you want your villains to actually be compelling enough to offer a threat to your protagonist and also to keep the reader interested in what you're doing. Before I get to that, let me answer a question. This is one I get kind of commonly. So let me go ahead and answer it. It has to do with following a word count goal or not. So I'm just going to read it. It's from Alone D. Walker. Like a lot of people here, I guess, I'm a hobby author, and one thing that somehow bugs me is the thing how you described the measured process. So and so many words written a day. Isn't the quality more important than the quantity? I once also, like I have to write a lot a day. The result was bad even from my non-professional point of view. So it's somewhat strange hearing you going on and on about the numbers of words a day. I know it sounds somewhat rich from a hobby writer to say this to a professional. I guess I'm a professional. I don't know. Perhaps that's the way a professional sees it, but to me it's somewhat strange. By the way, I like your tutorials about writing. So this idea that there's a dichotomy between quality and quantity is a false dichotomy. The goal is not to be good or fast. The goal is to be both fast and good. That being said, as a writer, you need to decide how much work you can adequately do in a day and how much time you can actually have to work. The advantage of a word count goal over, say, I'm going to sit down and write 2 hours, is that you have a quantifiable target. And if you fail to reach that quantifiable target, you can then make decisions about how much more time you want to spend to reach your target goal of words per day. Now, this is something that a lot of professionals do. Now, I don't spend 100% of my time drafting. That's just the second phase of a 4-phase process that brings a book into market. So I don't spend all of my time drafting. A lot of times I'm not writing any words at all. I'm working on other parts of the business. But when I am drafting, I like to have a word count goal. It helps the product continue to move forward by a measured amount. So you're sure that you're going to finish by a certain time. Your draft, if you've planned a book out and you know it's going to be 100,000 words, you're writing 1,000 words a day. You know at the end of that 100 days or so, you're going to have a completed project. I try to write a book in about a month and a half or 2 months. And then I spend the rest of the time doing all the other stuff. So I like to do sprints, are a little bit more effective for me than just writing 1,000 words a day. But where I started was writing 2,000 words a day every single day. And that yielded a huge amount of work and not a great amount of time. And that's really what you want to focus on. Now, do professionals do this? The answer is hell yes, they do. Stephen King was very, very open about the fact that he wrote 2,500 words a day every single day. He was always drafting, and that's how he came out with so many books. Part of it that he was in a traditional publishing cycle where he could finish a draft and then be working on the next draft and be editing a different book because he didn't have that much else to do. But you can see how many books he actually came out with. Now, the idea that there's a dichotomy between quality and quantity, it's like, isn't it better to write 500 good words than 2,000 bad words? And the answer is actually not, because if you never finish your book, then you will never have any product to be good or bad. So the first goal ought to be finishing your first draft, and then your second goal will be learning how to fix that first draft so it's a little bit better. The other thing is about people who are beginning this process, who are just getting into being an author or writing fiction, or even writing nonfiction, but especially writing fiction. And this is actually true for comic artists as well. You gain more from the iteration, from repetition, from just doing it than you actually gain focusing on the quality. And this is something I noticed as a guitar instructor years ago when I taught at a university and a college and a bunch of different places, and as a guitar student. And I learned this first as a student, and then I learned to help my students understand this better, is that if you spend an entire semester working on one piece, which this is what a lot of university guitar students would do. They'd spend their whole semester working on one piece. And that was kind of what I did like my first 2 semesters. And I was like, man, I'm just not going anywhere. So I changed what I was doing, and I focused on trying to learn as much music as possible. And if a piece was too hard for me to learn all the way through within a week or 2, I abandoned it and did an easier piece. And so within a year, I had a whole hour of music, and I could start playing gigs and making money. And there was also other informative things there too, which is that like the difficulty of the music doesn't translate into marketability. But the more valuable lesson is that I got to be a better guitarist by knowing more music, because each time you come to a part that's difficult, you learn how to do it, you find it in other pieces. So you can actually learn a more difficult piece much more efficiently by learning lots of easy pieces. So it's better if you were a beginning or intermediate guitar student to just learn a bunch of easy crap to begin with, because if you spend a whole year learning a hard song and never really get good at it, get good enough at it to perform, you haven't really accomplished anything. More than that, if you spend that whole year working on that one piece and it is good enough to perform, well, you only have one piece. You can't really do anything with that. You need to have an hour worth of music, preferably 2 hours if you want to be playing somewhere, even at like a restaurant or something like that. So you haven't really accomplished anything with your career either. But if you spent that time doing a bunch of easy pieces, you'd find that the hard piece at the end of that process is actually easier to learn. So the process of doing it ended up being better. And so when you translate that to writing, you actually will get better at detecting quality and producing quality by writing more words. The closest you can get to 500,000 words, like I'm just going to throw this number out there. There's no study behind this, but that's about how many words it took for me to get good at what I was doing. It took 500,000 words. At the end of 500,000 words written, I was a good enough writer that I could write a good book. Now that seems like a lot, but if you're writing 1,000 words a day, that's a year and a half. Whereas there's people who spend 6 years in university and come out of it not being able to write a damn thing. So if you're just doing it, you're going to learn a lot more than if you're stopping and trying to think about quality. And part of it is that you haven't developed the ability to detect quality quite as well as you will once you've written that many more words. So when I go back and look at like the first book I ever tried to write, which I wrote at like 19, it was not good. There were things about it that were great. Like I wrote good prose and good descriptions and, those sorts of things. But the things that really mattered, I wouldn't have detected how bad the characters were, for example. I wouldn't have detected the awkward dialogue. I wouldn't have detected the lack of plot structure because I had to get through all those iterations to do it. So, no, it's really good to have a targeted goal for your day of work. That's a very, very helpful thing. Don't think of this as a dichotomy. Last thing I'll think, if you are working for yourself, you're your own boss. So imagine that you have an employee, if your employee said, hey, do you want this done quick or you want it done right? And they have a task that they have to do every day, like clean the bathrooms. It's like, I don't care. The bathrooms have to be cleaned. They have to be cleaned every day. That's what you need to do. You wouldn't accept that dichotomy exists or that that's an excuse for not finishing it on time. So you need to make yourself your own employee and say like, no, you need to actually do this. You need to actually complete your work on time, and you'll find that you much more quickly get to that point where you're actually completing your draft and you have a book that you could edit or publish and do all those things with. So that's a really common one. It's this idea that there's some competition between quantity and quality. The truth is, the more quantity you go through, the better the quality will end up being. So it's not a bad thing to focus on the quantity of words. Let me address any more questions before I get over into villains. Let's see here. Do you think the Taoist perspective on duality and Gnostic metric are useful in cutting into the bone marrow of the story? I don't know about that. I don't think I can answer that. I don't think I know enough about the Taoist perspective on duality to answer that. That depends on what you want to do. I'm pretty much a Westerner. I think of things in Western terms. What does writer's block mean to you? Writer's block to me means you don't know what happens next. That's what writer's block means to me. And if I don't know what happens next, it means I haven't planned what I'm doing well enough, which means I need to go back and figure out where the story's going, and then that's going to determine what you go next. So you figure out, oh, I have a goal over here, and then you can work backwards. So writer's block to me, I haven't really had problems with writer's block very much. And when I do have them, it's because I haven't done a lot of thinking about where the story is going or how I'm getting there. I don't know what happens next. That's writer's block. What do you think of the largely Eastern concept of a friendly antagonist, or an antagonist who either is or becomes a friend to the antagonist, or to the protagonist? I'm assuming. I think that can be a great thing. It really depends on the story. Like, the story can feature antagonists that then become, they have a mutual enemy. People that are opposed to each other have a mutual enemy, and they end up becoming friends. So that's a common thing. I don't think it's just Eastern. I think there's lots of Western examples if you stop and think about it. That given said, an absolutist approach in your angle, is it a poor or overly reductionist approach? I don't think I could say that. Like, absolutist doesn't necessarily mean reductionist. But it depends, because if you read something like Ayn Rand, the philosophy is there, but the story is not. Like, the stories are okay. They're not bad, like Atlas Shrugged and Fountainhead are not bad stories, but they're far too long for what's in them, in my opinion. Meaning, the problem is not, she wrote the plots to expose the philosophy, and everything was about her philosophy, and none of it, very little of it was about the story. So if you have everything in service to a philosophy, then the story's going to suffer. And then people are not going to think. So, Atlas Shrugged can make you think a lot, but that requires people to get through the book. Whereas 1984, which is an extremely well executed story that also makes you think a lot, and it has a deep philosophical base behind it, that's more the ideal to me than Atlas Shrugged. And 1984 is a much smaller book, and is much more focused and concentrated. So because it's focused and concentrated, and because it's trying to tell a good story, the philosophy is that much better in it. What do you think of villains with no coherent philosophy? I'll talk about that. I was watching a fascinating new anime and saw this go live and hopped on. Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks for coming on. I don't want to be a novelist specifically, but an aspiring writer. These intrigue me. Yeah. So is the old rule of practice makes a master? Yes. That's the old thing. The master has failed more times than the novice has attempted. So you need to just do it a lot. And that's really where most of the growth is going to come from. You've got to learn by doing. Is Piglet the co-pilot on this one? Yeah. That's my Piglet doll. He's always been in my office for like 20 years, so I always been carrying him around. Some people have 10 years of experience. Some people have 1 year of experience 10 times. That's a good one. Truth is stranger than fiction. The tragic villains like Darth Vader, Anakin Skywalker, and Mr. Freeze, you can't help but empathize that they still did these horrible things. Yeah, so we'll talk about that a little bit. Okay, so let's dig into villains. So the first thing about making a villain, and I'm going to use antagonist and villain interchangeably. The antagonist is the person working against the goals of the protagonist, right? So if the protagonist is a bad guy, then the antagonist would be a good guy. But we're really thinking about bad guys. We're thinking about people that the audience doesn't like, or they don't want to succeed. So if you were to look at Empire Strikes Back is more about Darth Vader's goals than it is about Luke Skywalker's. And so Luke is Vader's antagonist if you look at it from that perspective. But Vader really is the villain. He's the bad guy. So what makes a bad guy effective as a bad guy? Well, the first thing is that the bad guy has to be powerful. And you have to have his power displayed in a way that the audience is going to see it and understand what it represents as a threat to the protagonist or to the main character or to whatever characters it's a threat to. So the problem with a lot of movies when it comes to constructing a villain or a lot of books is that the villain is too weak. The villain doesn't represent an overwhelming power compared to the protagonist. Some really good examples of how this is done well are probably some of the most popular ones. Darth Vader, as an example, especially in Empire Strikes Back, he's continually shown as not just being wicked, but being extremely powerful. He force chokes a guy across I don't know if it's on the same ship, and he's talking through like a monitor, and I think it's on a different ship, and he like chokes the guy to death, right? And so you get this idea that he's really strong. It's to display that, and so it's natural to understand that our protagonists, our heroes, are at a big disadvantage to somebody who can magically choke them to death. And indeed, you have that scene in Empire Strikes Back where Han and Leia walk in and there's Darth Vader, and it's a big surprise. It's this big, shocking cinematic moment. And so the first thing Han does is shoot him. And Darth Vader just blocks it with his hand and then sucks the gun out of his hand. And it doesn't even faze him. He's not remotely scared. It wasn't. So Han Solo was literally zero threat to Darth Vader. And so that plays into it again. All of this hypes up to this meeting that Luke is going to have with Vader. Is Luke actually going to be able to overcome Vader? And in The Empire Strikes Back, which is something that's almost never done in cinema prior to this, is the hero fails. The hero is not strong enough to overcome the villain, the bad guy, at the end of Empire Strikes Back, and so he's defeated. And he, in fact, tries to commit suicide at the end, but it ends up falling gets sucked into the vent and then falls out the bottom and gets saved by Leia, who's able to sense him. And that's our first bit of understanding that there's some connection, that Leia has some sort of force connection. But anyway, that's a great example of him in that movie. Now, in the first movie, he's still a very competent villain, but not nearly as frightening as he is in Empire Strikes Back. And I think that's one of the reasons people like Empire so much. And when I do my analysis of Empire Strikes Back, which will be coming out in the next week or two, hopefully, if I can get it filmed, that's one of the things I'll talk about, is the characters. The way that these characters are presented is very effective in that movie, and particularly Darth Vader. Another good one is actually not so much from the villain being good, but the villain being frightening. Everything that isn't the protagonist being frightening is actually the Harry Potter series. So one of the things you'll notice about Harry Potter is that it's children. And whenever you have children as a protagonist, it's very easy to create things that are more powerful than children. So even though the children are wizards, they don't understand magic. So continually adults are doing far more magic than what the children can do. So it's always believable when an adult is able to easily overpower a child. And of course, if there's a wizard that all the adults are afraid of, you have this inbuilt horrible fear of this particular wizard, because not only is he stronger than all the adults are like infinitely more powerful than you too. So you're like a worm. It really has a good effect on that. And Rowling actually uses that in pretty much every book. There's this barrier between what the children know and what the rest of wizard society knows. And this actually brings me to a little interjection I'll make. If you guys have seen Fantastic Beasts, I haven't seen the new one, but I watched the first one on video, and it's got like a really torturous first act. But one of the big problems with it that people complain about is that it removes this sense of Harry Potter's universe making sense. And to me, it didn't really remove that, because I always knew it didn't really make a whole lot of sense to begin with. And that's because she uses this trick where the magic system isn't known by the main characters, it's known by the adults, which lets her make it into whatever she wants. When the main characters are adults with full knowledge of the magic system, now all of a sudden it's just like Deus Ex Machina nonstop. The audience doesn't have a sense that there's some sort of limitation or danger to the characters. And that's one of the problems with that movie. And I imagine it's going to be a problem in the second movie because, again, you don't have this barrier between the protagonists and the rest where they are inferior and powerless. We have super chat here from Jonathan M. Thank you so much for the $5. I've learned so much from you. Just wanted to say thanks. You inspire me every day. I really, really appreciate that sentiment. So hopefully this will be useful. So that's what goes into making a villain effective, is they need to be understandably more powerful. And so when you make a villain, if you have a protagonist that's too powerful, it's almost impossible to make a villain that is going to end up being more powerful than them. And you can look at Force Awakens as an example of a bad iteration of this, where you have this character Rey who, her powers appear basically out of nowhere, and she's powerful with zero training, and she runs up against Kylo Ren, who in the first scene is very powerful and frightening, where he stops and so what J.J. Abrams did is he he used some of the things that Lucas did to show the power of him. So at the beginning, there's a blaster bolt that shot at him, and rather than him blocking it with his hand, because Vader had robot hands, which allowed him to just like block blaster bolts, he stops it in midair. And I remember watching it in 3D, and there was this like blaster bolt, and I was like, this is cool. Like the first scene was really cool to me. And it showed this guy is like a scary dude. And then he murders someone without any kind of compassion. So you have two things. And the second one is showing that he's particularly wicked. So you show that he's powerful, and you show that he's wicked. The problem is when the protagonist comes up against Kylo later in the movie, she easily overcomes his power multiple times, in fact. And so we lose the sense that he's a real danger. So going to the second movie, we're not really afraid of him, because he's already proven that he's not up to the task. And that's because JJ couldn't make the decision of whether Kylo was going to be Vader or if he was going to be some apprentice. And so by the end of the film, he's really just like some apprentice guy. And that's not very scary compared to the Master Vader, who kills Obi-Wan, right? Or Obi-Wan really disappears, but you hear him say, "Now I am the Master." That he really is a frightening villain. And that's one of the problems, I guess, with the sequels, is that Snoke is not particularly frightening because he never does anything, right? He does almost nothing in those two movies, and then he just dies, and he's killed by Kylo. And we already know Kylo's inferior to Rey, so there's never an impending sense of danger from a villain. The only danger in The Last Jedi really comes from just this overwhelming fleet and the fact that they're running out of fuel and blah, 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 blah. It comes from the situation and has nothing to do with any personalities or characters. All the danger comes from the plot and not the characters executing any kind of plot. So that's an interesting thing to think about. Let me see if there's any questions before I move on to... So that's how you make a villain scary. We'll talk about how do you make them convincing and believable. Which is basically going to deal with their motivations, their actions, and how they're displayed. Let's take a look here. Who's your favorite villain? Hard to say. I don't know if I have a favorite villain. Maybe Agent Smith. Agent Smith was a really compelling kind of villain to me, partly because he was a knowable computer. In the past video, you said you had learned tremolo and flamenco classical finger picking in a couple of weeks, going robot mode behind the TV. Is that really true? Yeah. So I got my guitar out, decided I'm like, I really want to play some tremolo, and I couldn't play tremolo at the time. So I got my guitar out, and every day I just turn on like The Simpsons. There was an hour of Simpsons between 6 and 7 at night. I didn't have cable, so my TV options are really limited. And The Simpsons is on between 6 and 7, and I like them. And I literally just practice P-A-M-I. String 6, string 1. Until it became, I don't know if you can hear it, until it became like completely solid. And then I started adding the left-hand fingerings into it and learned a couple tremolo pieces. So yeah, I learned it in about a week. I had the technique pretty much down. And then from there, it was just making little tweaks to it. A lot of people do tremolo differently from each other. A lot of people believe that you need to be preparing when you're doing tremolo, and I'm actually fully against that. I can talk about, maybe I'll do like a guitar stream as another stream sometime, like once a month, to talk about guitar technique. But that's how I learned it, and it was great, because then your mind, you're doing a repetitive motion. You're just programming your cerebellum basically to obey what you wish it to do. You're programming in a motion, and then you don't have to think about it. It's great. Would you consider relatively Norman Bates as a tragic villain despite being a psychopath? I don't really consider him tragic. Mostly just a villain. Only the Joker stood out in The Dark Knight. Of how many Batman movies? For every Hans Gruber, there are countless unremarkable terrorist villains. True. What about Darth Vader in comparison to Thrawn? I don't know if I can make that comparison. Who's more suited to being a villain, the Virgin or the Chad? The Virgin. So Incredibles 2. We'll talk about this when we talk about motivations. Or not Incredibles 2. Incredibles. The first Incredibles movie, animated Pixar movie. The villain is basically a virgin. He's like a gamma. He's rejected by Mr. Incredible because he's like, I got all these inventions, and he's like, go home, kid. And so it literally as a child, he's rejected. And so he's like grows up to become, with his goal to destroy all the superheroes. It's the slave mentality at work, not to become a master, but to turn all the masters into slaves. And that's exactly what he wants to do. He was like, everybody can use my inventions after I'm doing with them. I want everyone to love me. It's totally one of these motivations. So let's talk about some of these motivations, and then I'll try to jump back into some of the questions. So motivations. A villain's motivations can go two ways. One way, it makes them very convincing as a villain. The other thing that can happen, though, is that it can unexpectedly make them sympathetic. And it kind of depends on the execution of the filmmakers as well as the audience's perception of those motivations. So if you make a villain have noble motivations, the audience may end up liking him. And they may end up wanting him to succeed. And in that case, you may have inverted your story in a way that you really didn't want. So you really want the villain's motivations to be understood to be incorrect on some level. And there's a couple ways to do this. So there's 5 kind of big motivations as I see them. The first one is temptation. Temptation has to do with, wanting something and then therefore doing something bad to get it. There's Satanism, which is what I call the power of the self, which is the quest for power in and of itself. Misplaced nobility, which I just mentioned, madness, and revenge as a separate idea. Now, you could look at revenge as a temptation, but revenge is really a perversion of justice in a way. It's seeking a bad form of justice. And usually people can understand revenge as a motivation, but then condemn the action. So depending on how you want to execute that as a storyteller, that can be really effective or it can make someone too sympathetic. Let's first talk about temptation. So temptation is when a villain wants something and then he's going to do bad things to get it. So he wants love. He wants someone to love him that does not love him back. And so he does bad things to try to make that happen. Either he wants to kill the girl's boyfriend, or he wants to manipulate her into liking him. These are all things which make for an extremely unsympathetic and dislikable villain. When somebody wants especially love, and then they do bad things to get it, they come off as extremely creepy. So it can be a very, very effective motivation. And it's a pretty common one all throughout history. I mean, Shakespeare did a lot of these sorts of things. Even with more tragic characters like Othello, the feelings that surround love cause bad actions. And even though Othello is really more of a protagonist that has a tragic fall, you could easily see that transplanted into villains, which actively do bad things because they want something. So another one besides love is pleasure, which is the search for leisure, sex, money, those sorts of things. Power over others. Now, I did mention power of the self, but power over others is what the motivation for Syndrome was in the Incredibles movie. He wanted to be the superhero. He wanted to have power not just over other people, but really to have power over the superheroes themselves because they rejected him. So they rejected him, and so his way to correct that is, I'm going to have power over them. Not just revenge, but actively be able to be better than them and prove like, I'm better than you. Revenge could be temptation, but I really view it as a separate thing, because when somebody wants revenge, what they're seeking to do, they're seeking to kill the hero not to get something, but because that's what they want themselves, that they feel that they have to correct an imbalance. There are almost too many examples to talk about when it comes to a villain choosing temptation for a way to do something bad. You can think of like Gollum from Lord of the Rings, who he doesn't really... he says he hates Baggins forever, but he's really willing to do anything. He'll betray, he'll lie, he'll do anything to get his precious ring back. He has a strong desire to possess the ring, and he will do any kind of bad thing to acquire it. Likewise, Boromir is, as a tragic character, has that same motivation. Even though he's not a villain, he's really a tragic hero. He has that same motivation. He ends up wanting to kill Frodo because he's tempted by the ring. So you have lots of different shades in here. If you want a villain that can be extremely creepy, one that's very tempted in this way can come off, and also have one that transforms from a sympathetic or likable character into one that's really gross and dislikable. So temptation works well. The second one I mentioned was Satanism, or power of the self. And I'm using that in the Christian sense. So you guys have to think that Satan means adversary. So the traditional view of Satan or Lucifer is somebody that wanted to have power unto himself. And a great expression of the satanic would be, say, Sauron from Lord of the Rings, or Melkor from the Silmarillion. Melkor probably a better example, but Sauron kind of acts just like him as his chief lieutenant and then later his own master. What Melkor wants, what Morgoth, is his other name, wants, is to order the world according to his own will. He doesn't just want power over others to make them do what he wants. He wants to be the creator. He wants to be God, and he doesn't want any God really above him. He doesn't want to submit to the authority of God. He wants to be the ultimate authority or the ultimate God. This is really, really common in comic book villains. The really epic comic book villains, they're versions of Satan, right? They're visions. They're visions of Lucifer, this idea that they're going to overthrow the moral order and impose their own order, which they see as better. They're going to overthrow God and impose their own creation, which they want to have better. And Tolkien's view of this, you see that all of Morgoth and Sauron's creations are twisted versions of what God has actually created, what Eru has actually created. So the orcs are twisted versions of elves, the Uruk-hai are twisted versions of men, the trolls are twisted versions of Ents. None of them are creations unto themselves, because part of Tolkien's view of creation and subcreation is you can't really be original. That the building blocks, everything that God created, you're just merely creating because you're like God. So that was part of his philosophy, and expressed it all the time in his books, which is great. Some other great examples of satanic ones would be, say, like Lex Luthor. Most versions of Lex Luthor. There's so many different iterations of Lex Luthor. It's hard to tack one down as like, this is the Lex Luthor. But he's always seeking to create his own order and be his own power, and using his wealth and stuff to do that. Darth Vader is an example of a Satan, of a Lucifer. He is the most powerful Jedi in a sense, right? He is Lucifer. He's the morning star. He's great, and he's beloved, and he's a hero, and he's ascended so quickly. And then he becomes Satan. He overthrows the Jedi to impose his own order, the Empire, upon it. And at the same time, he always wants to overthrow his Dark Master. He always wants to overthrow Sidious. He says that to Luke. He's like, together we can defeat the Emperor. He has foreseen this. So Darth Vader's primary motivation is, in the traditional Christian sense, satanic. He is an iteration of Lucifer, of Satan. Those kinds of villains, to me, are very, very powerful, because that is something that I think exists in the human will, and we can connect with it. It's the desire to be the master of the world, to master everything and not be subservient to a will above your own, and not be subservient to God. That's ultimately the satanic thought, and it kind of exists in all of us. So it's easy to identify and to fear it, because it's a temptation that can kind of take hold of you. Rather than you do bad things to get something, it's like doing bad things, you are submitting to your own order. The next one is misplaced nobility. And after I do this one, I'll take some more questions, or I'll answer some more questions. Misplaced nobility means the character has a noble goal. Maybe their noble goal is to what they view as save the world, and they're going to do something bad to get it. So a really good example would be like Ozymandias from Watchmen. He has this noble goal of ending the Cold War, and he's going to do something very bad to get it, which is blow up a city, and to make these two superpowers realize that their mutual enemy is Dr. Manhattan. So that's a really, really good example. The problem is with misplaced nobility is that if you make the motive too identifiable for the audience, then they may reject it. They may reject the idea that the protagonists should win, and they will want the protagonists to lose. So this is one of the things about Watchmen that I thought was interesting, is that basically all of the characters gave up the fight at the end, except for Rorschach, because they saw that the ends justified the means. And I was a person that doesn't really believe the end justifies the means. I didn't like that. And then I think at the end of the movie, God, I haven't read the graphic novel in so long, but at the end of the movie, he like blows up Rorschach because Rorschach is like, I refuse to submit to that conclusion. And then you do see like his diary like getting distributed at the end, which would have the real story. So that's an interesting conflict that wasn't resolved. But a lot of people saw that as like, oh, yeah, they got convinced by that themselves. And that's something that kind of disturbs me. Another one is Thanos from the Avengers movie. If you haven't seen Avengers Part 1, basically Thanos wants to depopulate. He wants to cut the population of the entire universe in half because people are going to use up all the resources. The problem with that one is not that it was noble, but that it was stupid. And I did a whole video on this because it basically flies in the face of any kind of standard logic and any knowledge that you have about the way the populations grow. So if you cut the population in half, you've only set back that maximum population level by like 30 years. So you're going to end up with the same crisis in 30 years. You'd have to be killing half of everybody every 30 years to do it. Now, besides the fact that like overpopulation itself is actually a myth when you look at the evidence, it's also just as a thing to insert. Whenever you hear somebody say that like the Black Death was good because it reduced population, every person who died in the Black Death was replaced within like a generation and a half. So long term, the Black Death did nothing to stop the growth of European population. And it really didn't bring about the Renaissance. All the seeds of the Renaissance were already happening in the medieval period. There is no like, oh, Black Death happened, now people for some reason are enlightened. I'll just insert that in there. Maybe I'll do a video on that mistaken thinking. But misplaced nobility is another good one. And that makes, when you do it well, then the audience understands why the villain's doing it, and they may have a certain amount of sympathy even if they disagree with it. Now, the best thing to do is if they believe that they're noble, but their end is bad and their means are bad. So they have some noble goal of like, oh, there's a good one. Killmonger from Black Panther. He has a goal that's noble for himself, which is this pan-racial hegemony run by Africans. And maybe if you believe in that, that's identifiable. But obviously, since I'm not black, I looked at that as like, well, that's a pretty wicked, awful goal. And pretty much everybody else thought the same thing. Everyone in Wakanda didn't like his goal or the way he was going to do it. It's just some people went along with him because he was king, and some people were like, I guess this would be better than just allowing chaos. You know, very few people thought that there was something special about like there should be a pan-racial hegemony over all the earth. So that to me is a good example, and I thought it was effective that he wanted to do that, and it was bad, and he was doing bad means to get it. It made him an effective villain. And you also had many scenes where Killmonger was able to show just how powerful he was, which made him something to be feared. And that's part of exposing the villain, is that they have to do things that show them as powerful and things that show them as evil. So they have to be doing some bad things for you to, as an audience member, to really know that he's a powerful threat and that you don't like him and you don't want him to succeed. All right, let's answer some questions, and then I'll get to maybe the last one there. Who is more suited to being a villain? Okay, did that one. Do you think Final Fantasy adaptation could work as an animated series? I say adaptation, but really I mean an original plot in the spirit of older Final Fantasies rather than adapting an entry. Absolutely. The problem with looking at any kind of RPG as being adapted to a story is that gameplay comes before the story. The story is explored through gameplay. So if you were to play Final Fantasy IV, and if you were to try to turn it into a movie, it'd be weird to have these characters entering and sacrificing themselves all the time, because that kind of happens to help the gameplay along. You have different classes and different guys. You know, it's like, why is this guy a martial arts master and this guy's a Dark Knight? It's like, it's part of the systems of it. So if you can separate the story out from the systems, you might have something good. You can actually look up Final Fantasy 13 the movie, which is all the cutscenes and actual like dialogue of Final Fantasy 13 turned into one long YouTube video. And you realize that the story of Final Fantasy 13's, like, the gameplay I thought was really good, but the story had very big execution problems. And I could do a separate video on the execution problems of the story. But if you just watch it as a movie, we used to call it, me and my friend used to call it Final Cutscene 13, because it's just nothing but cutscenes. If you're doing it to help people explore the systems, that's fine, which is more of what they were doing. But if you're trying to tell a story and then having this interruption of gameplay, sometimes you have this competing desires going on. So the problem with RPGs is that gameplay really should come first and stories really come second. So when you do an adaptation, you're going to have to be throwing a lot of stuff out and rearranging a lot of things in order to make it happen. I like strong heroes. For example, in the movie Tombstone, Doc Holliday. Yeah, Doc Holliday's good. Doc Holliday also has a profound weakness in tuberculosis, so you see him sick all the time. But he has, underneath him, he has like a subtle strength. So I like Doc Holliday a lot. And I also like, and I'll talk about this motivation, which is madness. Was it Curly? One of them, the one played by Michael Bain, he's insane, and so that makes for a very good motivation. And I'll talk about that in a second. Let's look at some more questions here. What are the rules if the bad guys are creatures that have intelligence? Is it important to make their distinction from others through animalistic traits like the predator, smog, etc.? It's hard to say. Like, if they're not human, then they should have some sort of foreign characteristic. It's why I like Agent Smith, is that he's somewhat unknowable as a computer entity. Smog is also unknowable. So if you make them very different from human, they can be frightening just because they're unknown. The Predator, likewise, we guess he's kind of a hunter, but we don't quite understand him. And that makes sometimes for a more frightening villain. But I don't know about if it's important to make that distinction. I think it's effective to do it. I don't know if I would say it's important. But deconstructionists told me that Urks were all evil because Tolkien was a racist. Tolkien, I never got the perception that Tolkien was a racist. And if you actually look in Lord of the Rings, he doesn't do a whole lot of description of orcs as having like African traits or anything like that. He does describe the Southrons as having, these particularly dark traits, but they're not African traits. He doesn't say like, they had pronounced lips and a wider nose and dark hair and curly hair. He doesn't describe Africans. He describes some other like subrace of man that's rather wicked looking. Like they have narrow eyes that are like kind of red, and they have like scowling flat faces. To me, he never describes Africans, so I don't see how it's racist really at all. But it's really about how orcs, as having long drooping arms and being ugly to look upon, that's the main thing that you get from orcs, that they're a twisted version of a more a good looking human race. And one of the things about Tolkien is that his mythology is based on European mythology, and so it reflects Europe. It doesn't reflect African mythology. Otherwise, an African would have written something that more reflected African mythology and African culture. So to view it through a lens of like, well, he's not having a good representation of African culture. It's like, of course not. He's writing based on European myth. Like, why would you expect that? He also doesn't have any representation of Eastern myth either, good or bad. So that stuff is just missing. It's just Eurocentric, and there's nothing wrong with that, because that's where he was from, and that was the mythology that he was interested in. That was relevant to him. That's what he wanted to write about. He was a Westerner, So the modern layer of like asking older Western writers to write from Eastern perspectives or something is nonsense to me. Dragon Slayer kind of reminds me of what happened to Death Note as well, just in a different way. Death Note's interesting. So the main guy in Death Note is kind of a villain, right? I know he's the protagonist, but he has a satanic motivation. He wants to be a god. I'm talking about like the original anime. If there's a manga, I didn't read it, but I've seen the original anime, and I tried to watch the movie, but I couldn't get through it. It just wasn't good enough. And maybe I'll do a video on it at some point. But he has a satanic view, and he's kind of tempted into Satanism. Like, I could be powerful enough to be a god, and because I'm very smart, I would be a very good god. So all those motivations are understandable, but also kind of frightening. And as the series goes on, he becomes like more and more wicked, and stops being the protagonist at a certain point, and really becomes like a bad guy, while his nemesis, who is the antagonist, really becomes the good guy. I'm trying to remember. I don't remember the character name right now, so just forgive me. But he's the guy that is setting traps for him and was working with the police. I think it starts with an L, but you guys will correct me, I'm sure. You're better at thinking with these things on your feet than I am sometimes. Let's see if there's anything else. Yeah, all the buildup gets dismissed with this new villain that's in Star Wars. The movie also does a much worse job portraying the foolishness of Ozymandias. The comic makes a point of showing good people right before Ozymandias kills them. Yeah, the comic is actually better at making him a bad guy. And he is like a, he is a guy who with very misplaced nobility, but he's very much a bad guy. And I disliked in the movie how, all the heroes get to the end and they're just like, yeah, you're right. Yeah, you're right. It's like, come on, guys. Did you can't just like change your mind on the morality at the very end of the entire plot. I actually am not a fan of the Watchmen movie. I didn't really like it. I thought it was very nihilistic, and I didn't even like the style of it. But that's just me. If you like it, that's okay. The argument for the Black Death is that it allowed a movement of people. Now, let me answer this because this is good. I just scrolled past it. The argument for the Black Death was it allowed for a movement of people because you need workers, but population determines how many workers you need. Actually, research has suggested there was no migration in the Middle Ages of people, except into places where there were not people already, into steppes. So Nassim Taleb, who had an epic couple weeks talking about IQ on Twitter, they've already discovered this, and this is well known. There was no migration of peoples. There was no movement of workers during the Renaissance or anywhere else. The movement of workers was very, very minimal, in other words. And when people did move, their genes didn't move in, which means they didn't stay in those populations. So if they migrated somewhere, they migrated out. There was very, very little migration except into empty steppes. So as populations grew, they went into places that they didn't live before. They developed technology to live in new places. And there was a warming trend that happened after there was a thing called the Little Ice Age, which also had an impact on population. And then there was a warming trend that happened after that. So there's the medieval warm period, then the Little Ice Age, and then there was a warming trend that happened after that. But genetically, when you look at genetic history, there really was no migration of people. Maybe like people moved to the next village over, but movement of workers, the idea that movement of workers creates wealth is not really true either. What enhances wealth is more specialization. And the increase of specialization was already happening in the medieval period, in the Middle Ages, and continued to increase in the Renaissance. What happened with the Renaissance is that we started getting better and better at it. So these things have a big growth curve. So if you double your specialization each generation, you're doubling how good you are at your specialization. There's going to be almost no effect for a long time, and then the growth is going to be very profound. And it's the same thing with population. So if you kill the population by 1/3, then it's just back the next generation, and then it continues to go up. So I reject the hypothesis that the Black Death had any significant impact on the Renaissance, other than perhaps making people more religious. And as people got more religious, they might have gotten smarter as well. But the idea that killing people makes them, there might be some post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic growth. But the idea that killing parts of the population creates economic growth is nonsense. It's a broken window fallacy. Cain over Logain. Cain's an anti-hero, though. I like Cain, yeah, from Final Fantasy IV. It's like sometimes he's a villain, sometimes he's a hero. You always want him to be the hero because he's so competent. And see if we can get some. Did you discuss how to have an antagonist force be effective? For example, showing some German soldiers in World War II doing honorable things versus just making them all evil. Okay, so if you don't want to make your villains too sympathetic, otherwise your heroes are going to feel bad about killing them, unless that is something that you need your hero to be conflicted with. So does the hero need to be conflicted about killing the villains? Then you make them more sympathetic. You can still make them powerful, like if the German soldiers are doing good things and then the Americans have to kill them and they feel bad, that's part of That could be part of the story and an important part. But if you're just wanting the villain to be someone that's very satisfying to kill, then you don't want to make them too sympathetic by showing them doing good things. You want to show them kicking the dog rather than saving the cat. I like your thumbnail. It makes me feel relaxed. Well, thank you. That's actually a picture of some trees by my old house at a park. So I just liked the clouds and I took a picture, and there it is. If you choose an evil character as a main character, do you have to draw the line somewhere? Or are they as free as antagonists in their wrongdoing? It depends. It depends. The audience, like if you read something like Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, you can really push the limits of what the audience is willing to accept with a dislikable protagonist. Thomas Covenant is one of the most dislikable protagonists in literature. And I don't even know if I want to recommend the series. It's like I like it in some ways, but I think most people probably wouldn't like it. Partly because of the way it's written, but mostly because he's a really vicious character. So it just depends what kind of effect you want. You have to make that decision for yourself. Let me get back to the last couple motivations, which is madness and revenge. So madness is like a chaotic evil thing. Best example is probably the Joker from the movies, Thanos from the comics, and someone like maybe Green Goblin. If we're going to do we'll just do 3 comic book heroes, right? So the Joker in The Dark Knight is this great example of somebody who's literally insane. And there's a great scene where Alfred the Butler explains it to Batman. He's like, some people burn the world down just because they want the world to burn. They do it for sport. They don't have a motivation, in other words. Their motivation is purely evil. There's no evil. It's not satanic evil. It's just chaotic. They have no specific set goal. And these can be the most frightening kinds of things. And to me, madness can include villains that are almost more like forces of nature. Just real quickly, we mentioned Predator. The Predator isn't really a villain. The same way the alien in Alien is not a villain, or like the aliens are not villains in Aliens, or the Alien Queen is not a villain. Those are forces of nature. They're unknowable. They are unreconcilable. They have no goal, really, that you can perceive. That, in other words, they're not relatable in any way. They're literally a force that has to be reckoned with, has to be overcome, has to be destroyed. So the Predator, even though he does have a motivation, he's not a villain, right? He's a thing that's infinitely more powerful than the people getting killed by him, and you have to figure out a way to survive him. It would be the same as if you wrote a story about surviving a hurricane, right? The hurricane is not evil. The hurricane is doing its thing. It's being a hurricane. So the Predator's being Predator. And it's the goal of the protagonists to overcome it. Nor do you feel like, you don't feel sorry for the Predator really when he dies at the end, when Schwarzenegger finally gets him. You just feel like he's even grosser and more disgusting and more evil. And there's a satisfaction to it, but not because it's like he deserved to die. It's more just like, Arnold won, yeah, that's great. So that's something that's talked about. This is different from madness, but madness is the character's, really quite insane. You could look at stuff from Charles Dickens, like Great Expectations. What's her name? The girl and Mrs. Havisham. Mrs. Havisham was mad. She was a mad sort of villain. She had no sane reason to do things. Whereas even Hitler wasn't insane. Like, he made it be insane at the end of his life from like syphilis. That's people have this idea, but to him, what he was doing was not insane. It was just profoundly wicked. He had some sort of noble goal in mind when he was doing it. It's really misplaced nobility, not madness. Madness would have been like he just randomly killed people. So you show madness by the character doing things that make no sense. So in Dark Knight, you have the Joker burn all the money, and he's like, I'm only burning my half of the money, which is a weird thing because he should just burn all of it and kill the guys. But, he's unpredictable. And the unpredictability makes for, in many cases, a more frightening and more difficult to predict or a more difficult to overcome villain because you can't use his plans against him very well. And actually in Dark Knight, he kind of does, but not Batman. Here he's like, you have to pick which one is going to blow up. one of you has to pick which boat's going to blow up, and the prison inmates refuse to say blow up the other people. And there's like this moment of nobility there that the Joker didn't expect. So that overcame his plan, but his plan was just to be a nihilist, right? So nihilistic motivations are essentially madness as well, to see the world burn. At the end of Fight Club, Tyler Durden essentially becomes a madman. He becomes a nihilist and becomes the antagonist of the story. So, and not all characters have to start as villains. They can become villains. So he really becomes the villain and becomes a madness. And when you finally get that final scene where Edward Norton shoots himself and Tyler Durden goes away, Tyler Durden is literally the other character's madness incarnate. It's his vision of his own insanity. And so he cures it by killing it, in a sense. So that's an interesting and good one as well. The last one is revenge. Revenge is one that's just, it's easy to understand, but it's also easy to want to oppose. Like, I want to get revenge on you because you killed my father. This is a really common one in comic books. And we understand that for the villain's perspective, but at the same time, it doesn't make us like want the hero to die. Because it may be like a misplaced revenge. I want to get revenge on you because you killed my father, even though I don't understand that my father was the Green Goblin and was an insane evil guy, right? So the Green Goblin was insane, and his son was like, oh, I'm going to get revenge on you. I think there's some of the Spider-Man movies. That's something that is really understandable, but it doesn't make the villain sympathetic. So revenge is a good one there. That one's pretty simple to get. Oh, I think I have a super chat here. Reclaimer Bear says, Ty, thank you. I didn't know that the argument was correct. I didn't think that the argument was correct, but I didn't know some of that. What about the no philosophy villains who don't think things through? Yeah, those are like the madness guys. So somebody that is just hyper impulsive. Somebody mentioned Bates from Psycho, right? It's madness, right? He's almost more like a force of nature than anything like that. So anyway, I appreciate the $5. I'm not sure about your question. Like, if you could write your question again, I would answer it. The no philosophy villains who don't think things through are generally madmen. So that madness motivation can be really, really very frightening. And all you have to do to show that somebody's mad is to have them act in any unpredictable way, especially early on in the story. So you could have a character say, well, I'm gonna let's say you have like a bad wizard and he's going to fight some guys and he's like, I'm going to blow you up with my fireball. And it's like, but our soldiers are over there. And he's like, I don't care. And he blows up his own dudes and just to get at the good guys. Or like he has the good guys captured and they're going to tell him whatever he wants and he just kills them anyway, or just has them tortured to death because of no reason. Like, so when you have people act without reason, just doing purely chaotic things, that's how you can impart that madness. And it makes for a really effective villain, I think, a lot of times. Let's answer some questions. Any advice for handling villains that are from politically correct groups, i.e. groups that is politically incorrect to portray as villains? I think you know what I mean. I don't have any other particular advice. If you're trying to avoid catching some sort of hatred, you could always make the protagonist a minority, the same minority, right? So if it's if it's not kosher to have a black villain, you have the hero also be black. Like in Black Panther, the hero and the villain are black, right? So no one objected to Killmonger being black because, everyone was black in the movie. so there's nothing to, Black Panther is a super interesting movie because it got to do all of these things that you wouldn't really have, Hollywood really wouldn't have approved of these themes had it been a bunch of Europeans walking around talking about the things that they're talking about, like keeping out foreigners and whether the race should dominate the earth and whether their ethnic identity and national identity is more important than their racial identity and things like that. Like what they owe their race. Those sorts of things are are so not okay to talk about if you're European, that it was really almost comical to see them just openly discussed in Black Panther and to be a big part of the story and motivations of the characters there. So yeah, you could make them both minorities, or just accept that some people are gonna use that against you. You'd be like, why did you make the main character black? Or why'd you make the villain black? It's like, because that was how he's gonna be. I think there's a line though. So I think I said this on Twitter. In any scene, a character, the writer reveals things about himself when he writes. He reveals what he knows, what he wishes for, and what he's afraid of. So since we're talking about villains, when you write a villain, you're revealing things that you're afraid of. So if you're afraid of a villain that like can't be stopped by a gun, it kind of shows that like you rely on your gun for protection, right? You're afraid of your gun not working. Or a villain who takes away guns, then you're like afraid of gun control. Would be an example. So whatever you write as the villain, that's the writer showing things that he's afraid of. Or he points in the darkness and he imagines an alien that can read his thoughts. Like, you're afraid of people knowing your inner thoughts and using them against you. But the other thing is what you desire. So I saw a couple of panels posted from an upcoming comic. And I'm not going to say who wrote them, but it showed the hero literally torturing a Latino man. So the Latino man was, they showed him like, I don't know, he was like hitting his girlfriend or something. And so in comes the hero, and he like breaks his wrists and is telling him all the nerve damage that he's going to do. He's literally torturing this bad guy. Now, when you have a scene like that, what does that reveal about the writer? What does that reveal about the author? It reveals it's something he fears. He's afraid of Latinos. He's afraid of Latino gangsters. It reveals something he desires. He wants to torture them, which is rather frightening, and reveals what he knows he doesn't, or what he doesn't know in this case. It's like, so I don't think he really knows like how to torture someone, but if you have a scene of like your white hero torturing a minority, you might want to think about what's motivating you to do that and check yourself. And any torture scene, you don't want to have heroes engaging in torture. I'm just going to say this. Like, you can do it. You can do whatever you want to do because it's your project. But the most effective thing, if you're going to have a hero do torture, is they don't want to do it. Like, they have to do it, and they recognize that it's like a bad moral thing. The comic panel that I'm thinking of, the hero actively enjoyed torturing this Latino gang member. That comes off really creepy. So beware of that. But you can have a villain be like a black gangster, and he can be frightening without it being like a racist stereotype or something like that. Like nobody. Well, there probably are people who think this, but like Quentin Tarantino had the mob boss in Pulp Fiction as a black guy. Nobody said, "Oh, how dare you portray all black men as gangsters?" because two of the black men in it were gangsters. It's like, well, it was a movie about gangsters and they happen to be black, so who cares, right? So I think it really just depends on how you're doing it. So that's a great question, though. I would say just do it, but be a good writer and make sure that you're not like engaging in some sort of weird fantasy about like a race being inferior or something like that. Like, treat the villain as a human, an evil human, but human, and you won't have the problem. You won't have the problem at all. Let's take a look at some more questions. The question is about the idea of elemental villains. This is from Darkspawn. This is probably a great question. We know a force of nature is relatively neutral in its existence, but can it be perceived or written as a kind of primordial evil in a story? Yes, and I think Predator is a good example of that. Or Alien, right? So once you make it into a creature, it can become a kind of primordial evil. And of course, in European mythology, you have primordial gods, both in the Norse tradition and the Greco-Roman tradition. So in the Greek tradition, you have Nyx, which is literally night. You have these early gods that are primordial. So the god of night, the god of death. You have death personified actually as a kind of villain in Marvel Comics as well. these primordial personifications, they can't really be reasoned with. You don't expect them to change their mind, and they are powerful and fearful. So you can have a personification of a force of nature. This really kind of goes into that madness. But of course, like, there's a logic to death. Death wants everyone to die because that's what everyone has to do. So the infallibility of death is not evil. That's just based on its nature. So I think you totally can do that. The primordial evil, you can make it personified. You can make a primordial evil that's like a sea monster, a white whale that's going to destroy your boat. All of those things represent some sort of evil and fearful thing. Although you might recognize that the whale doesn't have morality. The whale is acting with malice towards you. And so when the whale destroys your boat or the monster eats your boat, then you can think of it as an evil force. But it is primordial, and it's not fallible, and it's not something understandable. That's what makes it natural to me. The Nothing from Neverending Story is a great example of an elemental villain. Yes, it is. A primordial evil that is depicted as a force of nature. He is. So nothingness has no essence. It's the opposite of essence. It's nihil. It's nothing. I have a $20 super chat. Let me take a look at that. Thank you for the $20 from Kaku. Could animals or creatures or spirit ghosts have a subliminal meaning other than just a force to overcome that isn't clearly evil? I think they can. How can you create a villain in a comedy when absurdity, madness is everywhere? How do you create a villain in a comedy? Let's take the first question there. Could animals, creatures, or spirit/ghosts have subliminal meaning other than just a force to overcome that clearly isn't evil? I'm going to use subliminal as just I'm going to use that as a metaphorical meaning. The meaning can be perceived as what you want, because subliminal would mean that it's like it's intended to not be perceived. So yes, you can. So like when Tyler Durden gets killed, he is representative of the madness that has taken hold of the main character, whose name I have forgotten. But he's representative of that. He is a force to overcome that isn't necessarily evil, because he starts off as something that Edward Norton really needs. He really needs this character in order to be himself, and then it becomes a character that gets out of hand and he has to destroy. Animals can totally mean that. So if you have read Pinocchio versus seen the Disney movie, Pinocchio represents the rural Italian moving into the city during the industrialization of Italy at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century. So he's a naive child. He's a puppet that people can control. He makes all these mistakes. He's actually killed in the original version by being tricked into hanging himself. He has a conscience called Jiminy Cricket, and he literally kills his conscience. So he kills Jiminy Cricket so that his conscience doesn't bother him when he's trying to do all of these other things. And so, of course, Jiminy Cricket represents the traditional wisdom that comes out of the country that gets crushed in order to move into the more wicked town where there's vice available, gambling and entertainment and those sorts of things. So the original story of Pinocchio has these very clear representations of these meanings that are relevant to the main character and to the society that it was written in. Now, I understand why Walt Disney took a lot of that stuff out, because it'd be weird to try to convey all of those meanings that are relevant to early 20th century, late 19th century Italians in an animated movie that was made in America. So you just kind of took the premise and just made something new, is what ended up happening. But as far as villains, you can, I think you can do that. You can have a character fight what is in essence some personification of themselves. If you have ever read A Wizard of Earthsea, there's a really, really good example of this, is that he engages in some forbidden magic, and that calls forth this shadow creature that attacks him and horribly scars his face. And the rest of the story is spent with him either trying to avoid this shadow creature that's crawling after him. And we have this image of like it crawling through the ocean. It's faceless and unknowable. And he finally decides to confront it and overcome it because he's done running, and he sails to the end of the world and finds this shadow creature. Once he decides to confront it, the shadow creature stops chasing him and starts to flee. And so when he comes to the end of the world, he finally confronts it, and he takes it into himself because it is himself. And so what does it represent in Wizard of Earthsea? And so what it represents is his arrogance and his belief that he's better. And of course, eventually he becomes the Archmage. But as soon as he crosses that line and starts to try to do things that are beyond the scope of him, he does it to impress some other people, if I remember correctly. It's been a while since I read the story. And then the shadow creature attacks him. That's his own arrogance, his own ego. It's literally his ego, his sense of being godlike attacking him. And he's fleeing from it because he doesn't know how to fix himself. And then as soon as he decides he's gonna attack it, he's fixing himself. And then you see his confidence and his ability to do great things rise and rise and rise. And finally, when he takes it and takes it back into himself, he's mastered his own weakness. That's what it represents. And so that's a great example. And if you've never read Wizard of Earthsea, it's definitely a highly recommended fantasy book. There's so many different magic systems that just borrow very heavily from Ursula Le Guin in that book, and I am one of the authors that borrows from it. If you've read my fantasy books, it's a great place to start. And her idea is that the magic system's based on knowing this primordial language that can command things, and it's the language dragons speak. And so it has a lot of meaning there. There's layers of meaning, and of course, I put layers of meaning of that into my books as well. When Helga in Water of Awakening is fighting the kings of the Watchers, they are kind of a more primordial force, and their meaning really has to do with the desire of the spirit to be manifest in the world and to rule over it, rather than to be content controlling its own sphere and to be free. It's the misunderstanding that power in the world equals freedom and self-will. It's a satanic thing. So there's some examples. How can you create a villain in a comedy where absurdity, madness is everywhere? It's actually not that hard, because the villain just has to do bad things. There's villains in comedies. You don't have to make, if it's truly a comedy, you don't have to make the villain highly understandable. But there's one movie that comes to mind, and that's True Lies. A lot of people, I've realized, have seen True Lies and not realized it was a comedy, and that it was a movie that was very aware of itself and was intended to be very comedic, that James Cameron and Arnold Schwarzenegger made in the 1990s. It's actually one of my favorite action comedies, and it's great. The villain is a terrorist, and he makes these... He's clearly a Middle East terrorist, which you wouldn't get away today with because it was made before 9/11. So that would be off the table as being like racially insensitive, but at the time it was made, it was fine. And honestly, I think it's politically fine now. He has a demand that the U.S. withdraw its troops from the Middle East, that the U.S. stop being engaging in foreign intervention in the Middle East, which is a very noble, it's misplaced nobility. It's a very understandable motivation. And it actually is a very humanizing motivation for these terrorists, but the terrorists are also full of silly things, like they make mistakes, and you get this idea that this main terrorist is a really bad guy because he wants to nuke these cities. I will destroy one U.S. city each week until our demands are met. So you have this huge force, a nuclear bomb, but you have a villain that's very understandable as well, and it is a comedy, so the absurdity is kind of all over it. It's absurd with its own self, and it's even absurd with the fact that you're going to be blowing up cities. It's got really super high stakes, and yet the villain is very, very effective, despite all the comedy happening everywhere. So that's an example. I know it's not a pure comedy, but it's a great example of a villain in a comedy that works. You just have to have the villain doing bad stuff. Shooter McGavin in Happy Gilmore is a villain. He's a villain because he's jealous of Happy Gilmore, right? He just has like a really base motivation. I'm jealous of him and I don't want him around. So I'm gonna make his life miserable. Well, we don't like him for that reason. I eat pieces of shit like you for breakfast. You eat pieces of shit for breakfast? It's good. It's a good joke. Let's see what else is here. Hopefully that answers your questions a little bit. Thank you for the $20. I really do appreciate it. Do you think it's better to have a character as a villain or have it be an internal conflict as an antagonist similar to Jekyll and Hyde? Just depends on the story you're writing. Fight Club does the Jekyll and Hyde thing. Everybody can have internal conflicts. And that's Jekyll and Hyde, by the way. There's many things with Jekyll. A werewolf story is like Jekyll and Hyde. You have an inner beast that's going to take over you and do horrible things, and you must do something to keep that inner beast controlled. So who's the villain in a werewolf story? You're the villain. The protagonist is the villain. It's the other side of him. It's the danger he represents to society is his thing. It's really a force of nature because it can't be reasoned with or controlled. So there's no villain. But it does make for something interesting. What if Force Awakens took the approach of Kylo Ren becoming a cult leader after rebels destroy his village for reasons? That would have been interesting. Yeah, it would have been very interesting. Of course, there were no rebels to destroy his village. What are your thoughts on Final Fantasy XII's plot? I am personally enjoying the more political-oriented plot. I loved Final Fantasy XII. I'll just say it. I loved the gameplay. I thought the story was great. I thought the aesthetics were top-notch. It's actually one of my favorite Final Fantasy games. A lot of people didn't connect with I liked the characters of Final Fantasy XII as well, and I loved the world building. So Final Fantasy XII's plot is a great one. There's there's lots of inner conflict. There's political stuff. The idea of empire, everything that's going on in Final Fantasy XII to me was very compelling. And I understand why some people didn't like it because it's very different from the quest-based Final Fantasy games of yore that kind of ended with Final Fantasy X. But I thought Final Fantasy XII was really good. And I have the they remade it for, you can get it on PC. I have it on PlayStation, and I really enjoyed playing it because I kind of missed it when it came out for PlayStation 2. Because when it came out, World of Warcraft was out, so it was like there was like 2 years where the only game I played was World of Warcraft. Because World of Warcraft Vanilla WoW was so good. It was such a good game. It was so compelling and fun to play that I missed a lot of games during that time. So it was great to go back and play it. So I really like Final Fantasy XII. What do you think of villains with no coherent philosophy? Something that they have never thought through. Not mad, but they aren't necessarily logical. I think that works fine. It's just you're not going to... if you have them just acting erratic without them displaying madness, then I think the reader can kind of catch on and be like, well, this person's just kind of stupid and annoying, rather than having them be truly frightening. Or really having an antagonist having a counter plan. So in a lot of cases, an antagonist isn't just stopping the protagonist's plan. They have their own counter plan. So if somebody doesn't have a counter plan, then they're just kind of a foil. And that usually doesn't work out. Somebody said something about Baron Harkonnen. I think Baron Harkonnen from Dune is a great villain, but he's far from neutral, so I guess that's off topic. He's a great one. He has his own plan, and there's actually some really good things that Frank Herbert did with Harkonnen, which is he made Harkonnen physically disgusting. So this is another thing you can do with villains, right? If Harkonnen really just wants to seek power, he has the standard villain motivations. But if you really want to dig it in there, he's disgusting. He's covered with pimples. He's so fat. He has like hoverbots holding up his massive girth. He's absolutely disgusting. And so really disgusting things people are disgusted by, and they don't like them as heroes. So if you make your antagonist particularly disgusting, if you give him something disgusting about him, that helps. So if you make your villain, actually they do this with Darth Vader, right? You have that scene in Empire Strikes Back where you see like his gross scarred up head, and you see the helmet come down. You're like, I wonder what's under that helmet. It's probably really gross. That works well as too. So Harkonnen works great because he's disgusting. What do you think about the tendency of villains being tragic in past decades? Even the all-evil Voldemort has the tragedy of his conception. Does a simple good-evil dichotomy work no more? I think good-evil dichotomy always works, but it depends on your perspective. So, not to go too deep into this, but let's imagine there's two ways of thinking about it. There's the traditional Christian way that we have in the West. I'm going to leave Eastern philosophy to the side here, and I'm just going to look at the West. And then there's nihilism. So if you believe that we have a sinful nature inside of us from the fall, that there's good and evil inside of everyone, and there's Eastern philosophies that believe this as well. But if you believe good and evil is inside of us, then the temptation of evil doesn't need a great explanation. Why somebody would look over the curtain into darkness and want to step into it and become something evil. The world is full of temptations, even for the very virtuous. And so if you have that Christian worldview where our nature is fallen, then there's very little need to explain that. Tolkien, go back to Tolkien, Melkor is Satan. He wants to make the world in his own, according to his own fashion. He wants to become God. And as he does this in the primordial singing of creation, Eru looks at him and says, "Do you not realize that everything you do has its uttermost beginning in me, and that nothing that you do cannot be turned to my purposes in the end? In other words, you are going to do my will even by thinking you are not doing my will," which represents, that's fundamentally a Christian view. So there was no reason, was Melkor, did somebody do something bad to him? Did something bad happen to him to make him want to be God? No, that was just part of who he was. That's part of the evil nature inside of beings, inside of creation. The creation contains both good and evil. But if you're from the other side, if you're from now I said nihilist, but you can think of it as like Nietzschean nihilism or something else, where there in essence is not necessarily a good or an evil nature inside of us that could take hold of a virtuous person. Then you start looking for explanations. So this always happens. This is a very modern therapeutic psychological perspective. Everyone's like, oh, this person did something bad because he was mentally ill. You can hear mental illness. Well, to those of us who are old school Christians, it's like mental illness that's a dumb reason. People are evil. It's like if you believe in evil, then you don't have to look for all those kinds of explanations. So yes, Voldemort had a, quote, tragic beginning in that his mom, I think she used like a magic spell to seduce a muggle into loving her or something. And so Tom Riddle was upset about that. And so I think J.K. Rowling was really representing this modern kind of atheist perspective that like people have to be at its core. I don't want to get too deep into this, but at its core, for a lot of people, there's a belief that people are not responsible for their actions. Like people don't have choices, that they don't really have free will. And so anything that you do, anything that you become is the product of something that happened in your childhood. This is like a very old idea in psychology that people's personalities are the result of traumatic childhood experiences. So if that's the case, if that's your worldview, and I'm not, I'm coming from obviously I'm a Christian, but if you have that worldview, then obviously a villain needs some explanation as to why he is the way he is. So if you look at Killmonger, he has this very tragic kind of backstory that explains why he becomes a bad guy. Now, that doesn't make the villain less of a villain. He's still evil and you need to stop him, but it does humanize him quite a bit. So even if you come from a more classically Western fallen nature, I don't know what to call it, constrained vision of humanity, you can still include those elements, and it definitely will humanize the character and make them seem more three-dimensional and more believable. But not always. And in fact, some cases, really good characters doing evil things, they can just be tempted to do evil things. I've had characters, in Water of Awakening, I have a good character decide to do something evil, and it's not because he had some kind of bad childhood that made him have some bad motivations. It's because he was tempted to do something evil. There was something that he wanted, and he had to do something wicked to get it, and so he chose to do that. Right? Because that first reason, temptation. So temptation goes a long way. So I think it has to do with the modern perspective. The modern perspective really, really focuses on this idea that personality has some sort of causality. And you also get this with the people that talk about genetics all the time, which they don't usually understand. They're like, people's personalities are the result of genetics. When, we don't really understand genetics. We don't really understand them the way that most of the people who aren't geneticists pretend that we do. Just as an example, if you take a wolf pup and you just raise it without wolves, it'll still act like a wolf. It'll howl at the moon. And you'll sequence its genes and you're like, they're the same as a dog. So why is it howling at the moon? It's like, because we don't understand heredity as well as we think we do. And that's a hard truth. We don't understand the world as much as we think we do. If anyone is reading this, especially David, Ayakashi Samurai Horror Tales, I recommend for supernatural evil, and it's a spin-off from one of the short stories, Mononoke. I might check it out. I did write a supernatural horror story called Muramasa Blood Drinker that I'm rather fond of. What are your thoughts on? Let's see here. Let's keep looking. How about Vas Montenegro from Far Cry 3? I haven't played Far Cry 3, so I can't answer this question. Do you think a charismatic baddie is a good opposition in a story, swooning the audience from the good guy? It can be. It depends where you go with it, right? So if you have a really charismatic good guy or bad guy that everybody kind of wants to root for, you have to figure out where he's going to grow. And if you take him in a really evil direction, then I think that's very effective. If you take him in continuing to be a good direction, then the audience is like, they don't really root for anyone. And maybe you want that, but I think it can. I think you can actually do that and have it be pretty effective if you know what you're doing. I think that can work really well and be a great device. So I think charismatic villains can be great, especially if they have something that the audience really likes about them. They're very good looking. They're very charming. Maybe they have goals that are really good, but then they just keep doing bad stuff until they're just really unlikable. That's probably how I would try to direct that growth curve. Name some of your personal favorite villains. There's so many. It's hard to say. I think I like Pompey from Spartacus. I like Darth Vader, obviously. I liked Dooku in the Clone Wars stuff. I thought he was a good one. He had a very interesting set of character things when you actually got past the movies. Sauron's not much of a villain because you don't really know him, but he works on a philosophical level that I really like. I really like Walter O'Dim in the first Dark Tower book. I thought he was a really good antagonist, really good villain. Very interesting. You always wanted to know more about him, and kind of frightening that he brings someone back from the dead, and there's like some madness involved with that. There's so many, it's hard to say. Luther and Calvin strongly rejected the idea of free will. I think you might want to relook at what Calvin said about that. I don't think Luther and Calvin rejected the idea of free will. The idea of election is something that God knows, but not necessarily you. So if you're trying to ferret out election during your life, you're probably doing it wrong. So I don't know. I don't have time to get into like the theory of the elect, but there's a little bit more to Calvin. Calvin's a very interesting historical figure, and the theology that comes from him and his camps and was inspired by him is so complicated. I don't have time to talk about it here. And I'm really not the best guy to talk about it. You can check out Ryan Reeves' channel. He has a lot of stuff on John Calvin that's very informative. Voldemort just wanted to have a cake baked for his wedding. He's such a good guy. As someone with minor mental illness, he did it because mental illness perspective is bunk. Well, yeah, I mean, you think about that. Like, if somebody's, think about how many people, quote, have mental illness, or like, I remember there was a shooter and then they wanted to blame it on him having Asperger's, like him being mildly autistic. And it's like, there's millions of mildly autistic people who don't do anything bad ever, right? Like, that's so stupid to blame somebody's bad or evil actions on being mildly autistic. Like, it's just completely ridiculous. He doesn't get social cues. That's why he shot up this place. It's like, you realize like what you're trying to say about like a gigantic number of people who operate in your normal life and who you know and interact with every day. Come on, get out of here. And I don't like the mental illness thing for villains either. I think you probably want to avoid, quote, mental illness. Mental illness is something that people come up with to try to explain evil. So if you believe evil, write evil villains. And evil villains can still have a tragic backstory. You don't have to pick one or the other. But I think you should have them do evil things and be committed to their evil actions. Any tips for improving dialogue? Read it out loud. Read it out loud and hear what it sounds like when you say it. So, somebody who read my book said this, because I could tell which characters have an English accent. It's like, you can. It's like there were ones that I read out loud with an English accent when I read them, because that was the accent that I imagined them with. And so that translates into their word choice in some cases. So yeah, read it out loud. Wasn't Eru telling Melkor he had no free will? You need to read Boethius. This is complicated. So the theological idea of free will and election is complicated. We keep coming back to it, but essentially, if you act in a way, that doesn't mean it's an assumption of a certain amount of omnipotence on God's behalf that's not necessarily there. So if God knows what you're going to do, does that mean you have no free will? The question is, does God actually know what you're going to do? And in the Bible, it doesn't really say that. So you can look at, Boethius tackled this. Calvin's very complicated. The theology is very complicated. But basically, if you do something that's, quote, against God's will, God is able to weave that properly back into the pattern of how things are going to be. So he's not like an all-powerful puppet master, because that would go against the purposes of creating people that have desires to do things. And if there is no free will, then there's no sin to resist, right? So free will is always like a necessary part of understanding fallen nature, sin, the need for redemption, the need for forgiveness. Free will is important. And I don't even think Calvin rejects free will, even with the idea of election. It's more the idea that God has a clear idea of where things are going. And the question is, how clear an idea does that include? Who's going to be saved and who's not? Right. That's the theological question. Let me leave that for now, because that's such an interesting thing. It really deserves some other kind of things. Science is only our best understanding of the universe. I love this by Glitchy Gear. Those pseudo-intellectuals claiming science is fact always rub me the wrong way. Yeah, it's our best model. And so the skeptic looks at like what's effective and what's been working, and that's how you want to operate. You don't just throw that out with the bathwater, but you don't assume that you know every possibility and you know how everything works. We don't know how the brain works. Like, we know how a neuron works, but we don't. Neuroscientists don't know how the brain works. We don't know how consciousness exists. We don't know how people think. We just don't know. Like, we don't know how like a worm brain works, really. And that's like 300 neurons or something, 400 neurons. So how are we going to know how a human brain works? It's insane. This is why I'm not afraid of AI. I'm not afraid of artificial intelligence, because people don't understand intelligence. That's my perspective. We don't really know what makes intelligent. We can't even really define it, because some stupid is as stupid does, as they say. Let's take a look here. Can you elaborate on how Sauron works as a villain? I agree, but I thought he, she, it, them was more of a plot device. Thoughts? Well, Sauron, he is kind of a plot device, but all character actions are plot devices. So that's how it works. But even though he's not, you don't have any scenes of him like you have with Darth Vader, you get explanations of his will constantly, and he is exerting his will. You see the effect of Sauron on the protagonist. So he's kind of primordial in a way. He kind of represents the satanic intent, the desire to have power for oneself is Sauron in Lord of the Rings. So that's kind of how he works. Even though he's not very personal, he's there all the time, affecting how the characters act and perceive and their temptations. Villains in crime stories. Could the laws in this story create friction in a messy picking who's good, bad, and good, like Minority Report? Absolutely. I love stories like Minority Report. I like Philip K. Dick's stories in general. I think they're great. So yes, the contest between legal and moral is a great conflict, and you can create some great, like if you watch The Fugitive, you can create a villain or an antagonist that's really very likable, and that's Tommy Lee Jones's Marshall character in The Fugitive. He really wants to catch Harrison Ford's character, because that is his job and that's his purpose, and he believes that it's right to do that. And yet we know that Harrison Ford is innocent, so we don't want Tommy Lee Jones to succeed, but we don't dislike him and we appreciate and admire his tenacity and his intelligence and his ability to counter the protagonist's plan. So you can have protagonists and antagonists that aren't villains. You have like a hero and an anti-villain, a very likable antagonist. You can totally do that. And Minority Report, Minority Report's great because you have a friction between what the laws say and what you know is correct. And then the character's put in that perspective. He's like, wait a minute. These future crime things say I'm going to murder someone, but what? That makes no sense. It's like once you believe that that you can see the future, all of a sudden that turns back on you. That's a great device. That's why Minority Report works so well. I like the book. I like the story, and I like the movie a lot as well. Who's the more sympathetic creature, King Kong or Godzilla? King Kong. Would you consider both of them chaotic good or chaotic neutral? I think they're just chaotic. Yeah. But I like Godzilla. I like King Kong as a more sympathetic domain because he's a big ape out and he's captured and, tortured for amusement. Whereas Godzilla is literally just a reaction to an atomic bomb. He's completely, he's a different thing, right? You don't feel sorry for Godzilla, but you do feel sorry for King Kong. At least I do. One of the judges in Final Fantasy XII looks almost like a Black Knight version of Darth Vader. Yeah, I love the judges. Those are great. And I love the aesthetics of Final Fantasy XII. I'll have to do a video just on how much I like that particular. Here's the freshest slice says, everyone in Needle Ash had a British accent. Don't even lie and say otherwise. They did. Now the question is, do you know what accent the people had in Water of Awakening? Because I imagine them with a particular accent as well. Actually, a country accent for a lot of them. Who've transitioned into talking about the true source of evil and to a lesser degree, whether it's even real. Yeah, it's kind of funny like that. But it's great to think about that, and you can write stories about that. So you can write. I mean, that could be a big conflict. It's like where does evil come from? That's something to explore in a story. You have a character that does something unexpectedly evil, and everyone's trying to figure out a reason for it, and his reason is much more simple. It's just he looked into the darkness and was willing to do evil. The women in Needle Ash are Valley Girls. I have an English accent, and I imagine, this is what Film Girl says, I imagine most of my characters having an American accent. So I imagine some having an American accent, but it depends. And you can actually kind of guess because of where I'm from, right? I'm from East Texas. So if somebody's talking like they're from East Texas, somebody's talking, then you probably have an American accent in my head. How do you think the new Star Wars villains should have been written? Do you think the Kylo should have always been related to the Skywalkers, having be completely different? I think Kylo as a guy related to the Skywalkers would be great. I think that would have been awesome. Here's what I would have done differently. Kylo is just tempted to the dark side because the dark side is tempting. Power itself is tempting. He is jealous of his classmates in Luke's school, and he seduces some of them to follow him. And Luke goes off on his own pilgrimage to discover some other true nature of the Force to avoid and nullify this. And then he has some other followers that are with him as well. So you really have two groups. I think that would have been better because then it's like, how do you not kill? Luke didn't kill his father, so how does Luke face off against his nephew and not kill him? That would have been such a great conflict because as an older person, he's not so starry-eyed. He's like, how do I save him? Because I owe it to like my sister to save him. And I personally, I like EU Luke better. So that's probably would have had it. I think it could have been great. Problem is they made Kylo incompetent. They made Rey too good. Rey there was no reason for anything to be there. They didn't really establish why things were the way they were. There's lots of problems with it. The main problem wasn't that Kylo Ren was Ben Solo. Or he shouldn't have been named Ben Solo. He should have been named something else. That wasn't the main problem at all. Read the New York Post. AI bot gave SAS to the Chinese comic creators. Yeah, I've heard about like programming bots to write articles or like give informative articles. That's not really AI though. That's not artificial intelligence because it's just running a program. Actual intelligence always involves some level of creativity that's almost impossible to figure out how to program. Like you can program and I've done this. I've programmed computers to make music, but the music that comes out is garbage, right? Because you can create infinite parameters, but you can't teach a computer how to break parameters in a way that's unexpected. It just runs programs. And so if you can't make something that's smarter than people, then you don't really need to worry about an AI making, or, machines making machines that are smarter than themselves, because we don't know how smart we are or what makes us smart. So how can we make a machine that's smarter than us? I'm not afraid of AI. Some people are, not me. And when I wrote about AI in Prophet of the God Seed, it wasn't AI. So the super organism of the net, which controlled people's thoughts, was just the fact that people didn't know anything, that they had to retrieve all their knowledge from the net and didn't learn anything. It was a conditioned response. So the organism was more like an ant colony, not like an overarching AI that controlled people. It was just a pre-programmed internet that was designed to make the people drones continue to repair itself. So progress stagnated once singularity happened. That was something I wrote in Prophet of the God Seed, which is kind of how I would see it, and kind of my view of how I see people constantly looking at their phones and not knowing anything inside their head. You gotta have some local information in there. It's important to know things without having to look at the internet. I can think of a lot of separate scenes and character interactions, but I have time weaving them into a common thread or plot. Do you have any tips on dealing with that? Put the character interactions within a scene that there's a plot event. So the plot event is we find out that the enemy army's coming. Well, someone can interrupt two characters having a conversation that you think is important and say, "Oh, they're coming." Like, okay, great. So you've just weaved it in. You can look at many competent ways that this has been done. Mentioned Empire Strikes Back. There's a lot of competence in the way that they interweave just a bunch of little dumb flirtatious conversations between Han and Leia into otherwise, plot element scenes. So that's just what I would do. Just attach the essence of the conversation to some other event, and then it's easy. As a protagonist who knowingly uses evil aesthetics as a tool to do good, just an anti-hero or something different. I would call him an anti-hero. That's probably what I would call an anti-hero. Somebody who's just doesn't adhere, just is goal focused, and doesn't really adhere to a moral code. It's kind of an anti-hero. I would have had Kylo as the big bad to begin with. Yes, no Snoke at all. And have him as the leader, cult master of the First Order. And I would have had as the remnants of the Empire reformed. Yeah, I would have had that. And I would have had the reveal of Kylo being Han's kid, like way late. Like third movie. He takes off the mask and he's like a child. Because that's something that happens in Return of the Jedi, is that you take off Vader's helmet and there's a pathetic face. And I don't mean pathetic in like, he's pathetic, but like something that you have emotion toward, that it's like there's just a dude. He's just a man. He's not a monster. He's just an old man. So you take it off and it's a child, It's kind of like that scene in Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome where they rip Master Blaster's head off and it's like there's this, special needs child face underneath. It's very effective. It'd be very, very effective if you did that. Did the bot you programmed make vaporwave? No, it made electronic music. I could probably find the music somewhere. I used Max MSP and I wrote a bunch of programs that ran inside of it because it's like a Visual C interface. And it took George W. Bush's inauguration address from 2000. This is before he got re-elected. So this is like, I wrote this program in like 2003. And based on the letters and the sequence of the words, it would create music out of them. So use those as a way to generate randomness, and that plugged them into certain parameters that I had to create music. And the music really sounded awful, but that was kind of the point. And then the words would display on it, and then you'd sit there and read into a microphone. Meanwhile, the program, as it goes on, it's starting to operate a set of guitar pedals, basically a multi-effects pedal, and is turning on effects, right? So as you're reading this randomized version of George W. Bush's inauguration address, which would take phrases and like combine them in weird ways. So it'd say, what's very important is that we give in to terrorism. There was like, I remember I read that in the live version and I almost laughed because of the funny sentences coming up with, and then it would continue to do it until everything that came out at the end was just white noise. And so I don't know, it's a very postmodern piece. So during my postmodern period, you have to forgive me for that. But I was making a political point about how like you can't really say anything. Whatever you say that has meaning, it's just going to be turned into noise at the end. And I kind of still believe that, but no one would listen to that piece of music and be like, that's a great piece of music, man. That's beautiful. It touched me. They'd be like, well, I understand what you did there. My particular favorite Final Fantasy is Tactics. That's probably, as far as main series, it might be 12 or 4. But I really like Final Fantasy Tactics. I love the gameplay of Tactics, and there is a certain amount of cynicism, but the main characters are still very valiant and heroic and are trying to find the good in all of it. If you made a genuine artificial intelligence to be communist, it would convert to capitalism. That's good. All right, anything else? Cerebral David Stewart, the man, the myth, the legend. Thank you. Let me answer a couple questions, and then I'm like way over time. This has gone 2 hours, and my voice is starting to give out. So let me answer a couple more questions. It's way more popular this week than I thought it would be. So thanks for watching. I really, really appreciate it. Can an oxymoronic villain characters be double-edged and backfire in the story, like vegan shark in Shark's Tale? I think they can be funny, but only as a foil. Like, you can't have them persisting too long, because if the point is to be funny, that's only funny once, right? Which is why you don't see him coming back. Probably don't see him coming back over and over again. Oh, vegan shark and I don't remember Shark Tale. I was remembering the shark in Finding Nemo that's like, fish are friends, not food. Anything else? My favorite Final Fantasy games are 6 and 9 because I like their stories and I like 9's art style. 9's art style is great. I actually have the version, like the Android version, and will play it. It's a great little story, and gameplay's good. I really like a couple of those games for PlayStation because they couldn't render the entire environment, so they drew the environment. So the environment is like a painted picture, and then you are just kind of walking on it. And so the details, like, it's so much more Baroque than Final Fantasy X. Final Fantasy X looked like crap to me compared to Final Fantasy IX, and honestly played like crap, but I still kind of like 10. I don't know why. Maybe it's just nostalgia, but Final Fantasy IX, yeah, I have a lot of nostalgia for that one. And Final Fantasy VI as well. I like the Super Nintendo aesthetics better than the remake they did a lot. Let's see if there's some others that I missed. Can it work to have both your protagonist and antagonist come together at the end? It's I think you can. I think it's been done. I think it's been done, but it's all in the execution. As long as they have like compatible goals or whatever, then they can come together at the end. Let's see here. I think I mostly got all of them. If I missed one of your questions, I'm sorry. There's so many. This chat is so long that it's easy for me to miss things. All right. So it looks like I like Final Fantasy 15 because of the gameplay. Yeah, I haven't played it. So I have it. I got it like on a sale for like $10, and it's just sitting in my cabinet because I don't get to play on my TV that much. Speaking of Final Fantasy 9, there's another Square Enix game I played called, or I'm actually playing it right now. I have it in my 3DS right now. Called which I actually play this more than any other console right now because like I can actually, it's like, oh, I have 5 minutes, let's play a game. It's called Bravely Default, and it's very nostalgic for me of like Final Fantasy 9 because it has painted backgrounds that they've somehow turned into 3D images that like work, and there's weird cartoonish characters that are exaggerated. The gameplay's good. The story's a little weak, but you know, the nostalgia factor is worth it probably. So that's fun. I'd probably say, by the way, with 3DS, like the games I spend the most time playing are always Fire Emblem, because I really like Fire Emblem gameplay. Same reason I like Final Fantasy Tactics gameplay. If I was to choose between them, I like Tactics more than Fire Emblem as far as gameplay. But Fire Emblem has great gameplay, and it's really hard to get Final Fantasy Tactics gameplay. They don't come out with them too often. What are your thoughts on characters who are conceived as good in the beginning of a story, but are written later on as bad because the new character the writer wants them to fight is also good? I don't know. I can't think of anywhere I've seen that and thought it was good, so I don't know. I can't think of that. Like, you can have a good character have like a fit of jealousy and overcome it, but not usually like turn into a villain unless there's something important that they feel like they have to become a villain to do. So, Waifu Emblem, yeah. What was it? The other one we were playing for Switch? Xenoblade Chronicles 2. My brother-in-law calls it Waifu Blade Chronicles 2 because you're just like collecting, I don't know, you're collecting like anime girls or something. Yeah, Fire Emblem is really funny because you unlock dialogue. Like, characters have dialogue based on them fighting next to each other, which is a weird mechanic. But then like, you're always surprised with what they say to each other. It's like, oh, I'm gonna see what they say to each other, and then it's like, that was stupid, you know. Or they're like, man, that character shouldn't like that one. I don't like that. No, they're not getting together. I'm gonna split them up in the next battle and make them marry someone else, you know. And if they of course, like I'm always into systems, so the characters that end up married to each other in Fire Emblem are always the ones like, they're going to make the best child. Their child character is going to have the best traits, you know. And I don't think about like, well, they probably like each other. It's more usually like, oh yeah, they hate each other and like their dialogue is terrible, but you know, Na is going to be really good if these two get married, you know. So that's how I end up doing it. Divinity Original Sin 2 made Lucian evil so the player could fight him. Nice. I haven't played that one yet. Just played the first one. Another RPG that I think is great with characters is Dragon Age Origins, and I'm not a fan of other Dragon Age games, mostly for gameplay. Gameplay comes first. I think I'm going to leave it there, guys. Thank you for all the questions and the conversations. I will see you guys next time. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't yet. If you want to support my work, you can find my books all over the place. They're on Amazon. They are... the ad always says get it on Amazon. They're everywhere else as well. So all my books are wide right now, except for Needle Ash 3, which is going to be wide probably by the end of the week. So it'll be on every platform by the end of the week. I'm not doing Amazon exclusives anymore, and I'll talk about that in some other, maybe next week. Just talk more about business having to do with going wide or going narrow. So everything should be available everywhere, including my music. You can find the Zool music, zoolonline.bandcamp.com. You can find everything else at dvspress.com. There should be links to the Amazon stuff, or just Google my name in Amazon or whatever site, and you'll probably find the books. You can also buy shirts. There's shirts probably linked. I'm not wearing one. I'm wearing a Mayhem shirt, not one of my shirts, but I designed some shirts. You can buy them. Some people like them. There's a Scipio Africanist shirt, which I would recommend that you buy to show your respect for one of Rome's greatest generals. I'll probably do a couple of those. I'll probably do like a Pompey shirt and I'll probably do something like that. So anyway, thanks guys, and I will see you next time.